Would you open your Bibles to the book of Acts, chapter 12? Acts chapter 12, we're going to continue in this exposition. We're about halfway through the book. It might seem to you that it's been longer than that, but we are halfway through. And we're going to continue in the exposition of this wonderful book that God has given to us, describing the development of the early church. And today, in chapter 12, we're looking at a passage that is a little bit out of sync. In fact, it seems that it actually took place before, and there are reasons for believing this, before the famine that is mentioned in chapter 11. But the chronology is not precise at this point. The importance of the topic is, and so we have Peter's supernatural release from prison in Acts chapter 12. I want to share with you just a couple of thoughts by way of introduction. First of all, let's recap where we've been for just a moment. Remember that the book of Acts is divided up into 6 sub-books. We call them the 6 subdivisions of the book of Acts. First of all is the church founded in Jerusalem, which we've seen in chapters 1 through 6. Everything had to do with Jerusalem. It was the book of the 12 martyrs. Martyrs, of course, meaning witness. Only one person was killed as a martyr as far as we know at that point, and that was Stephen. And today we're going to see the second one, the first one, who is the apostle, first apostle to die. But secondly, we saw the church expanded from Jerusalem. The book of 3 witnesses, where we had Stephen and Philip and Paul, are mentioned. And this is the beginning of the expansion of the church. And then we came to chapter 9, verses 32 and following, and here we find the climax of Peter's apostleship. And so this ends, chapter 12 really ends the emphasis upon Peter and the emphasis upon Jerusalem. And so here we have the conclusion of almost half of the book, and each one of the concluding statements has a phrase that sounds a little bit like this: "But the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied." Luke uses that as a literary device to tell us that we've come to the end of a segment. And that's how we develop this. Now, as we move forward, we're going to see that the establishment of Paul's apostleship begins in chapter 13, as Paul and Silas and Barnabas are all commissioned there in Acts chapter 13 from the church of Antioch. And then we'll see that Christ is exalted among the Gentiles, so we have a movement into 6 major cities. And Luke describes those situations for us. And finally, we'll see that Paul is the one who takes the testimony of Christ to Rome. So that will be the rest of our time. Now, today's agenda, when we look at today's passage, I want to present it to you in a very simple way, and yet I hope you'll see that there's so much in this chapter that teaches us lessons for life today. But it's all about the supernatural release of Peter. Now, he's already been released from prison before in the book of Acts. But here is a little different take on how God can operate in order to get people released from prison. And so the setting for his release we'll describe first, and then there's a specific description of that release, and that's the rather humorous story of the angel coming into the prison itself and releasing Peter. And I should have called this message "Touched by an Angel," or better, "Whacked by an Angel," because that's what seems to have happened here, because the angel struck Peter's side and woke him up. You can just see him nudging him awake. But there's a very interesting description of this release. And then there's also the surprise at his release. That's another part of the humorous story. You can't read chapter 12 of Acts without coming to the conclusion that God has a sense of humor, and he includes it in the written record once in a while, because that is what we see. The surprise at his release, even though the church had been praying for that release. Now, you can understand the irony here, can't you? Sometimes we pray for things and we don't pray expectantly, and then we're just dumbfounded when he answers our prayers. Well, and then there's the aftermath of his release, and that we will look at in chapter 12, verses 18 through 24. Well, the setting of this is one of persecution. So if we look at each one of these divisions separately, first I want to talk about the persecution of the church. Let's read verses 1 and 2 here. It says, "And now about that time, Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them." You notice that there's a clear intention here about Herod. This is Herod Agrippa the first. And he's seizing those who are members of the church in order with the expressed purpose of mistreating them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. So the saints in Jerusalem not only suffered as a result of the famine that we discussed 3 or 4 weeks ago now, but they also suffered because Jewish and Roman governmental opposition against them intensified as the time passed. So we are at one of those points of intensification. It ebbs and flows throughout the book of Acts, but right now it's pretty hot and heavy. Luke records what happens in this section, however, to illustrate God's supernatural protection and blessing of the church. Even though the Christians suffered increased persecution, and Israel's continued rejection of her Messiah is seen in this passage, we find God's providential concern and providential care. Looked at another way, this section confirms Israel's rejection of her Messiah. It's like a leaven that is part of Israel at this time. And Luke is describing how that leaven just kind of grows. I like what Zane Hodges says at this point. He says, this is the leaven of hatred for Christ that was so clear at the cross, and now it spreads dangerously to his closest followers. So don't miss the point here. This is a time of extensive persecution of the church. People are being beheaded. That is exactly what happens to James. What a loss, huh? How is it possible that God would allow James to die? And yet, we'll treat that question in just a moment. Hodges also went on to say, clearly the church is always made aware by persecution that it does not belong to this world and is caused to remember the redemption of the cross in all of its significance. You see, we have a tendency, all of us do, to settle down into the world, and from this, the bread of affliction arouses us. I've talked with, I think, 3, 4 people now already this morning who have already gone through tremendous affliction. It seems to be rampant, doesn't it? But it is affliction, it is persecution, it is hard times that causes us to awaken to the fact that we are part of a huge plan. And God is directing, He is orchestrating, He is allowing, He's intervening, He's doing all kinds of things to grow us into Christ, the likeness of Christ. Well, as we're going to see in this setting, we have the deliverance of Peter. And here's an interesting quote about the deliverance of Peter, because it's a little bit unusual to be here, as I said before. Peter's rescue from prison is an unusually vivid episode in Acts, even when simply taken as a story about Peter, because it's not connected with the events in the chapters immediately before or after. However, it may seem rather isolated and unimportant for Acts as a whole. Yet it becomes more than a vivid account of an isolated miracle when we probe a little bit below the surface. It's an event that is so unique and vividly presented as such, it takes on the importance of the typical when it reminds us of other similar events. And here's what it does. It recalls the power of God to rescue those chosen for God's mission, a power repeatedly demonstrated in the past. And yet we read so far under this persecution of the church that we have one man who is beheaded. Now, you have to, maybe it would be more helpful for you to think of it in terms like this. James was a leader of the church. I'm a leader of the church. Can you imagine someone walking in, dragging me outside, and in front of everyone, beheading me? That puts it a little bit more stark, especially for me, it makes it more. But can you imagine what that would be like? That's the kind of thing that these people were facing in the first church. It says about that time, I think it's probably a reference to the time when Herod Agrippa wanted to please the Jewish people, of which he was a part. He was partially Jewish, and yet he, by his own abilities, was able to placate the Jewish population as well as the Romans, because he was a Roman servant or a Roman officer, you see. So he was in between these two groups, and he wanted nothing more than to keep the peace, and he wanted to make sure that the Jewish population was on his side. Luke seems to have wanted to close his portrayals of the Christian mission within the Jewish world with 2 vignettes having to do with God's continued activity on behalf of the Jerusalem church. And what we're going to see is the supernatural release of Peter as an example of the church, and also the supernatural death of Herod. So let's notice that Herod is the one who steps in to persecute Jews who believed in Jesus. Remember, this is still a family squabble. As the Christian Jews became increasingly offensive to their racial brethren, Herod took advantage of an opportunity to please the subjects by mistreating and executing others. I couldn't help but think about Israel today, and some of those who are in leadership in Israel have taken that very position of appeasing those who are very, very orthodox and rabidly opposed to Jews who believe in Jesus in Israel. So a similar thing may have existed back then. Now, we haven't had any deaths as far as I know in Israel, but I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't happen at some point. Let's analyze a little bit more about the death of this one James. One man said, the death of James, and what time is this? Well, it's Passover time. Verse 3 tells us, when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. Well, this is another Passover time. And the death of James at Passover time was like a Passover sacrifice for the church. His death must have been a vivid reminder of the cross of Christ and of what true Christianity meant in this world. I mean, we talk about discipleship. Here it was a life and death matter. If you were on Jesus' side, if you were one of his followers, it would be known and you would be marked as an individual to persecute and to mistreat. And yet it must have harked back to the very death of the Messiah himself and his call to his disciples, many of whom are in this book of Acts, to follow him even to the point of death if need be. Remember, Jesus said to these apostles, you must drink this cup as well. And that cup was the cup of death. Well, let's read on. It says in verse 4, when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. That even sounds very similar, doesn't it? The bringing out of Peter to the people, because the possibility of appeasing the Jews even more, to release a prisoner at Passover time. But this Feast of Unleavened Bread was a time, one of 3 during the year of the Jewish people, in which Jerusalem would have been swarming with pilgrims. So when you stop to think about what's going on at this Feast of Unleavened Bread, it would be a group of patriotic Jews coming into the city when Herod makes this grandstand political move of arresting Peter. These Jews knew that Peter was the leading apostle among the Christians, and they also knew that he was one who fraternized with Gentiles, according to chapter 10, where he meets with Cornelius. So he is hated by his own Jewish brethren. This was the 3rd arrest of Peter that Luke had recorded back in chapter 4 and chapter 5 as well. This persecution of the Christians didn't arise from anything that they had done. At least there's nothing in the context that says that it's anything that they had done specifically, like heal a lame man or whatever, but rather it's because of who they were. Herod wanted to gain popularity with the Jews, and so it becomes a political thing. He wanted to make sure that Peter was going to make it until the next day when he could release him. And so he has him guarded by 4 squads of soldiers. You may or may not know what that means, but it means that there were 16 individual Roman soldiers assigned to Peter. Some scholars believe that these 16 were around him at all times. They so wanted to keep him imprisoned. Others believe that they rotated every few hours, and so there was a group of 4, 2 standing at the door of the prison, of the jail, and 1 handcuffed to each arm. That's more likely the scenario. But keep in mind that Peter is there in prison, and it's just impossible for him to escape. 4 men every 3 hours, a total of 16 men. Herod wanted to be sure of this imprisonment, and all of this to point out the human impossibility of escape. And so, here he is, one who is imprisoned, the leader who is imprisoned. And yet we see in verse 5 that prayer was going on. Verse 5 says, "So Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God." Now, most people who read this feel that the prayer meeting was going on and they were fervently praying that God would release Peter. Interestingly, it doesn't say that. It does say that they were praying and that they were praying fervently. We assume that they were praying for his release. The rest of the story might indicate that, they were half-heartedly praying for something big because they couldn't believe it when God answered the prayer. In any case, prisons are no match for prayers. And the Christians prayed, and Peter's fate was in their hands, they thought, as they were praying to the God who could deliver. And they believed that God could effect his release again. He had done it before, so why wouldn't he do it once again? One man said the church used its only available weapon, prayer. They couldn't do anything else. Sometimes that's a last resort, isn't it? It should be the first resort. There was nothing that the church could do except pray, but they didn't pray for a miraculous release. And I want you to tuck that in the back of your mind because it might come out a little bit later in our discussion. It is certainly true, though, that when we are brought to the point where we've seen one of our leaders die by the edge of the sword and another one imprisoned, two of the apostles now are being affected, wouldn't you be praying? I would hope so. Wouldn't we all be forced into prayer? Another man said, "Affliction and testing has a way of uprooting the leaven of careless indifference and insincerity, and of bringing us face to face with God in sincerity and in truth." We don't like affliction, we don't like testing, but it does have a way of bringing the genuine article out in our lives. All right, so we've seen the persecution of the church and the imprisonment of the leaders and the prayer of the saints. Now let's take a look at the description of this release. Verse 6 says, "On the very night," notice the timing here, God is always on time. "On the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison." So the night before Peter's trial and probable execution, he knew what happened to James. He was sleeping soundly. How could he do that when James had just been executed? Peter had a record of sleeping when he should have been praying. You might remember that in the Garden of Gethsemane. He and the other apostles couldn't quite stay awake when Jesus asked them to. So he didn't have a problem with insomnia. Nevertheless, on this occasion, God may have wanted him to sleep. Perhaps he didn't fear his life because Jesus had said that he would live to an old age. John 21, verse 18 indicates that. But it also indicates that he would die as a martyr. So he could have been very, very anxious. If I were he, I would have been very anxious. Normally, the Romans would chain a prisoner by his right hand to his guard's left hand, but Peter was chained by both hands to one guard on either side of him. And Herod wanted to make sure that Peter didn't go away, as I said before. So here we have a situation where Peter, unbelievably, is composed enough to be asleep in between these guards. Now, verse 7 says, "Behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell, and he struck Peter's side, and he woke him up, saying, 'Get up quickly.' And his chains fell off his hands." Well, the instructions that come from this angel are very interesting. All of the rules for a prison escape are violated here, by the way. Usually you would not want to have too much light going on, but here the light illuminates the entire room. I think it would wake up the soldiers. And then there's a blow on the side of him that probably would have wakened someone rather than whispering, but he says, "No, get up quickly." And to arise quickly probably would have disturbed those soldiers, but so you can imagine he's jumping up in a half stupor, and the soldiers are right there beside him, so the clanging of the chains and the pulling against them, you don't plan a prison break that way. And he says, take your time, Peter. It's not like we need to run out of here, but take your time, get dressed, and put on your robe and your sandals. And then we're just going to walk past the sentries, and we're going to go to a gate that is there that we don't have a key for. So you've got a major miracle going on here. God treats Herod's maximum security arrangements as though they did not exist. And human efforts to hinder God are always equally vain and amount to nothing. So if God wants something done, he can get it done. This truly is a miracle. Luke clearly regards Peter's escape as a miracle, a divine intervention by a supernatural visitant. Thomas Watson, the Puritan preacher, said, "The angel fetched Peter out of prison, but it was prayer that fetched the angel." So here we have the prayer meeting going on. We have the composure of Peter, but the instructions of the angel, and Peter is released. I've often thought about this event, when we used to get our kids up for school. The parent is coaching the children. Come on, you know what I'm talking about. Some of you are smiling because you know exactly what it's like, and you have teenagers now. But anyway, you're dragging them out of bed. Tell them to put your shoes on. You get your coat on. Get ready, go out there, follow me, and go out the door. I almost get that picture that the angel is coaching Peter. He says, gird yourself and put on your sandals. And then he said, wrap your cloak around you and follow me. And he went out and continued to follow, and he didn't know that what was being done by the angel was real. So he's in a dream. He's half asleep. He's walking through this prison door, and they get outside. So I think you have to comment here that there was confusion on the part of the apostle. Peter was so groggy that he didn't know what was really going on here, that he was really being set free. He thought he might have been having another vision. Isn't that what it says? Yes. He thought he was seeing a vision. Well, we know that Peter has been given to visions, especially one with Cornelius and the tent, or the spread that came down. Verse 10 goes on to say that when they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. Well, that's another part of the miracle that's going on. God is clearly involved in this. And they went out. And they went along one street, and oddly, it says immediately the angel departed from him, there in verse 10. Well, Luke relates this incident as though God is orchestrating Peter's release, and there's no reason to take the account as anything else. Outside the prison, he's left alone by his angelic guide, and he realizes that the release is genuine. And so it moves from confusion to comprehension of the apostle. I think that what we have here is an interesting description of how God often works in our lives. Maybe you could think about it with me. Maybe there have been situations in which you have been in a very difficult strait, and yet you've had this unusual composure. And you know that people are even praying for you about the difficulty that you're going through. Now, I doubt that any of you have had the specific instructions from an angel. If you have, we need to talk more. But perhaps you've had instruction that comes right from the Word of God. Somehow or another, God has revealed to you that you need to do certain things in that given difficult situation. And there is a release that takes place. And you may not even know that it's happening to you, but all of a sudden, the light goes on and you realize that God has been orchestrating this entire thing, this release from a kind of prison that you've been in. I love what one of the authors has to say about this as it applies to the Christian life. It is somewhat taking a little bit of freedom with the text to apply it to the imprisonment that we experience, but I think it's quite possible that God had in mind that we should look at an incident like this and say, well, there is an application. Here's what one man has said concerning it. For the child of God who is snared and captured by the enemy, freedom is available. The Lord wants to wake us. He wants to give us light. He wants to cause chains of sin and death to drop off, to clothe us with His own character, and to lead us forth from the prison house of the authority of darkness into his light. Isn't that what happens at salvation when the light bulb goes on? You're really set free from an imprisonment that you've had. It's also the same kind of thing that takes place when you're struggling with a very, very difficult situation. And God, in His mercy and His grace, He does bring release, He brings freedom, He shines the light, and you have instruction from Him, some revelation, and it results in a measure of freedom that you've never known before. I think it's absolutely appropriate to talk about how we are confused, but we come to comprehension and we realize that there is deliverance. It's also interesting to note that this is parallel to what we read in the Egyptian prison, because God did for Peter here in this passage what He had done for the Israelites in leading them out of their Egyptian prison in the Exodus. God's enemies, once again, can never frustrate His plans. Matthew 16, verse 18, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. So even when we get into these situations where we wonder, it's just not going to happen. Well, we have Peter alive and well, and he's released, and a bunch of people are going to be very surprised. But can't you wonder why James is killed? And Peter's alive? Well, you might say, well, Peter was more important. I don't know about that. But the answer to this ongoing question as to why God allows some people to continue and other people to be killed or to die in the prime of their life, the answer has got to be in the sovereign activity of God. We had a young man who was a Dallas Seminary student who, of all the people that I could pick out of my first year class as one who would succeed in the ministry, it was this young man. Now, he had been around the barn a few times. He brought some experience into training for pastoral ministry. He was an extremely popular young man. All of the students were drawn to him. He had a gift to preach and to teach that I've seldom seen. He had a lovely family. And everyone thought, well, this man is going to go a long way in ministry. Before the end of the first year, he dropped dead of a heart attack. And so we wonder, how in the world is it possible that God would allow such a thing to happen? Surely the first church was wondering, how could you take James from us? But Peter is alive. Well, the answer to this is the sovereign will of God. He still moves like this in the contemporary church. Quoting Tom Constable, he says, I've been in the ministry for many years, and I've seen the Lord reach in and take certain wonderful members out of the church by death, and then there are others whom He has left. Why would He do that? If you'd ask me from my viewpoint as the pastor, I would say that He took the wrong one, and He left the wrong one. But life and death are in the hands of a sovereign God. It's His universe, not ours. It's God's church, not ours. The hand of a sovereign God moves in the church. Well, he's released, and now there's surprise. Let's look at the surprise in verse 12. It says, when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark. This is the name John Mark. This is the same man who is the one who accompanies Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. We'll see this in chapter 13. Barnabas' cousin traveled with Barnabas to Cyprus after the division between Paul and Barnabas. He accompanied Paul again later on in his ministry, and he also was with Peter. And according to the early church tradition, he wrote the gospel that bears his name under the authority of this same man, Peter. So John Mark is who we're talking about in verse 12, and he went to the house where Mary, the mother of John Mark, was also called. This must have been a home that was large enough to accommodate a group of people who were part of the church. And many were gathered together and were praying. Verse 13, when he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl came. Her name was Rhoda, rosebush. That's what it means. She came to answer. Now, I don't know. I cannot say this for sure, but it seems to me that in this passage we have a group of believers who prayed, but maybe one believer who believed, and it was Rhoda. I can't prove that she was walking around looking and hoping and praying expectantly that Peter would be released and he would come knocking on that door, but nevertheless, she was in the outer court there, and she heard Peter's voice, verse 14. Because of her joy, she didn't open the gate. You can almost see her fumbling with the gate. And did you ever ask the question, why would he need a key to that gate? I mean, after all, he just walked through a prison door. Well, don't ask those questions. But nevertheless, I think I can see her fumbling with this and running back and forth to the group and saying, you're not going to believe this, but Peter is outside. Because of her joy, she didn't open, but she ran and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate, and they said to her, you're crazy. You're out of your mind. The word literally means you are not in contact with reality. So reality for them was what? God cannot answer certain prayers. That's why when you go back to verse 5, you wonder, were they really specifically praying with expectancy that Peter would be released after James has been killed? Don't know. But verse 15 does say that they said, you're out of your minds. That's the problem of rationalism. Rationalism does not allow for the supernatural to take place. They were rationalists at this point. But she kept insisting that it was so, and they kept saying, well, wait a minute, it's his angel. Now, that's superstition. And superstition or rationalism will keep us from praying the way we ought to and believing that God answers prayer. 16, Peter continues knocking, and when they had opened the door, they saw him, and they were amazed. That's putting it mildly. So I think we have a group of believers who prayed. We have a young believer who believed. And we also have a group of believers who disbelieved. They were not trusting enough that we would actually see an answer to their prayer. They couldn't believe that God had answered the prayer so directly and dramatically, and Peter's still banging on the door. You can almost see this from a helicopter view. You can see them praying, and he's standing outside, and they don't know that things are going on. It takes a rota in between to make it happen. Well, here we have a patient apostle who has, I don't know, he's probably tired of knocking on the door, but he's allowed to come in verse 17, motioning them with his hand to be silent. Most people feel that they were praising the Lord because of the answer to the prayer that they had been asking. Anyway, he asked them to be silent. He describes to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. He probably went through this, rehearsed the same story that we just read, and he said, report these things to James and the brethren. Now, this is a different James, obviously. This is the James who is the brother of Jesus, not the James and John brothers. And then he left and he went to another place. Now, here we have the surprise. Part of the surprise. Part of the surprise is that he was released from prison. The second part is he disappears. At the end of verse 17, it says, he left and he went to another place after this report was given. He patiently shares with them what had happened in fulfillment to their praying for him. And then he says, make sure that the other leaders know what has happened, and then he leaves. I think he's being very prudent at this point. He's not presuming upon the goodness of God to keep him free, but he recognizes that he's still one that they're going to be seeking. And so he disappears. Now, nobody knows from this point exactly where Peter goes. It doesn't say, but I think that it's a surprising way to end this section because now Luke, the author, is going to move to the ministry of Paul to the Gentiles. Peter has been ministering to primarily the Jews, and now Paul will be taking the gospel to the Gentiles. Well, verse 18 tells us a little bit more about what happens. The aftermath of the release follows. Verse 18, when they came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. And when Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away to execution. That's quite a turn of the tables, isn't it? We have these guards, and very often a Roman guard who allowed his prisoner to escape would suffer the punishment of those prisoners. So if it was someone who was arrested for a capital offense and that prisoner got away, well, off with the head of the soldier. And I think that's exactly what happened here. And so they were led away to execution, and then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. I think he was just kind of hiding out in a way. But we don't know. We know that he dies there. And let's read about that death very quickly, and then we'll conclude. In verse 20, it says, now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. Well, that sounds a little bit confusing perhaps. In a nutshell, it's this. Herod had become displeased with his subjects who lived in that area, and because the towns depended upon Galilee, part of King Herod's country, for their food supply, they were eager to get on his good side again. And so that's why you have this convention in which he is speaking to the people of this area. Verse 21, on an appointed day, Herod, putting on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum, and he began delivering an address to them. And the people, who knows why, but they kept crying out. They repeatedly cried out, the voice of a God and not a man. So here we have an example of a man who is grandstanding for the people. Oh, I have a quote here that is quite interesting, I think. Josephus tells us about the death of Herod Agrippa I, and he recorded the incident in much more detail than Luke does. Just listen carefully to what he says. Herod appeared in the outdoor theater at Caesarea. It's a great place to be. You can stand there and see how Herod must have had this wonderful opportunity to speak to thousands of people. He stood before the officials from Tyre, Sidon, and his other provinces on a festival day, Josephus says, dressed in a silver robe. And when the sun shone brilliantly on his shiny robe, some flatterers in the theater began to call out words of praise, acclaiming him a god. Immediately, Josephus says, you can just see he has this gut-wrenching, immediately severe stomach pains attacked him, and attendants had to carry him out of the theater, and 5 days later he died. So how did he die? I don't know, but Dr. Luke saw that Herod's attack was a judgment from God, and he gave a more medical explanation of his death than Josephus did, because he says in verse 22, the people kept crying out, the voice of a God and not a man, and immediately an angel of the Lord struck him. I wonder if it was the same angel of the Lord, you don't know. Struck him because he didn't give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. One writer suggested that Herod suffered from appendicitis that led to peritonitis, which was complicated by roundworms. Who knows, but what a way to go, huh? What we can say definitely is that the pride of man had ended in the wrath of God. And we can also say that having set the innocent Christian leader, Peter, free, God now put the guilty Jewish Roman leader to death. And so God will always take care of his people. So the aftermath includes the death of Herod Antipas by execution, and it includes the growth of the Jerusalem church. The next words that come out say that the word of the Lord grew, continued to grow, and to be multiplied. And then verse 25 becomes the segue into chapter 13, and we'll look at that next time. So we have the growth of the Jerusalem church, and we have the end of book 3. But what are the lessons that we need to learn? Let me just share a few thoughts as we conclude. The first lesson is this: God is the one who determines the length of our lives and the contributions that we make while we are here. To me, that means we should be thanking God every single day for every opportunity we have to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with other people, or to build other people up in the faith. We should be very disappointed in ourselves when we spend one day tearing down the work of other people, or when we spend all our time criticizing what others do for the Lord Jesus. Rather, we should be sharing the faith and building up the saints. God determines the length of our lives and the contributions we make. Another point is this: persecution of the church promotes prayer among the saints. We might not think we're being persecuted today, but if you were to come to our prayer meetings on Wednesday night, you'd realize how many struggles, how many people are having, and how much intercessory prayer is needed in this little body of believers, as well as the church at large. Prayer meetings are still necessary. You're invited. Composure is possible in desperate straits. Isn't it great to know that Peter could actually be asleep on the eve of his trial and execution? Another point is that God delivers his own according to his good pleasure and according to his own devices. That's what he does. That's his role to play. Our role is to simply trust. And then finally, the church will survive all attacks of evil. I hope that we remember that lesson that comes from this passage. Let me just conclude with another thought that comes from John Ogilvie. He says this about the expectation of Rhoda that, that Peter would be released. He says, expectation is the gift that we offer the Lord in response to his gift of prayer. Now, what does he mean by that? This whole passage is about prayer, really. It is what we bring, this expectation, as an offering for our communication with him. Expectation is a blend of confident trust and sanctified imagination. It gives us the capacity to ask the Lord for what he wants to give. Maybe we can end with that thought. How weak and how feeble, how emaciated sometimes our prayer lives are because we don't believe that God can do, as he says, exceedingly abundantly above all we ask or think through Christ Jesus. Well, maybe a lesson from the first century, the book of Acts, the supernatural release of Peter would encourage us to pray that God would supernaturally intervene in our own lives to release us from prisons that we're in order to serve the living God. Let's stand together and close in prayer.